Every esport has that one match that you want your friend to see and understand what an avid gamer it makes you for having watched that match. Then there's the players who are already sweaty enough, but the game turns out to be such a drag that even a flood of deodorant wouldn't have helped anyone inside the arena. This video is about those matches, the ones that are beyond explanation, and just slightly less iconic than the one you played last night on a random unranked tournament. Let's get into it. First off is DRX versus T1 at Worlds 2022. This whole series was pretty insane, but then Game 5 is where both teams would embrace the nerd side and leverage the Force. Going into the 2022 World Championship Finals, almost nobody expected DRX to even be there. They weren't the favorites. They weren't even considered contenders at the start. Their entire run was built on surviving elimination matches over and over again. On the other side, T1 had Faker. Everyone and their grandma knows Faker at this point. By the time it reached Game 5, the tension was already high. But what made this game stand out was that both teams had forgotten what was at stake. It got so competitive that they could have handed the reward to the losing team, and it would be fine. They just wanted to win. There were fights where both teams committed everything, and somehow neither side fully collapsed. Objectives like Baron and Elder Dragon weren't cleanly secured, they were contested, delayed, sometimes even stolen or abandoned mid-fight. One of the defining moments came late into the game around the Elder Dragon fight. Both teams knew this would likely decide everything. The positioning was careful, almost hesitant at first, and then suddenly both teams realized they could actually commit. Abilities were thrown out, health bars dropped instantly, and within seconds the fight turned chaotic. What made it so close was less about mechanics, but more about thriving in chaos, strategically figuring out a way to save even one health point. Both teams had opportunities to fully commit or disengage, and each choice carried massive risk. In the final stretch, DRX managed to edge out just enough of an advantage to push forward. Calling it a dominant finish, like the one I did on your mom's face, would be too much. It was only just enough to get them the win. The game still stands out for how fragile the final moments were, and DRX triumphing over the favorites. Next up, we have Cloud9 versus FaZe at Boston Major 2018. This match gained way more relevance than it probably should have because of the final map, Inferno, as it went into double overtime. And by that point, both teams had already gone through everything. Momentum swings, missed chances, rounds that could have ended it earlier. What makes Counter-Strike matches like this so intense is how small each round is. You just do not need a full comeback. One good round, and suddenly you are on the driver's seat. There were clutch situations where players were left in 1v2 or 1v3 scenarios, and instead of playing safe, they took risks. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. One key aspect here was how aggressive Cloud9 played. In moments where most teams would slow down contrary to their name, these guys were on everything except Cloud9. Instead of waiting out utility or playing for time, they pushed through smokes, took unexpected fights, and forced FaZe into uncomfortable positions. FaZe, on the other hand, relied heavily on individual skill. Their players were capable of turning any round around with pure aim, and they did exactly that multiple times throughout the match. I'm not saying they could not play as a team, but given the scenario, just solo flexing was working better for them. By the time it reached the final rounds of overtime, both teams looked exhausted, but still sharp. Every peek, every angle held, every grenade thrown had purpose. The final rounds weren't decided by one huge play, but by a series of small advantages stacked together. Slightly better positioning, slightly faster reactions. That's what made it feel so close. There was never a clear moment where one team had full control. In the end, Cloud9 would continue to be angry and stayed cohesive to edge out FaZe, although both teams were absolutely deserving of the win after that display. Next up is Valorant, specifically Loud versus Optic's insane clash at Champions 2022. By this time, Optic had been considered the most consistent team in the world, putting up dominant performances throughout the year, so when they faced Loud, arguably the best team of the moment, a great game was cooking. This series came down to the final map, and by that point, both teams had already shown everything they had. What made this match stand out was how often rounds were decided by eco situations. In tactical shooters, those are rounds where one team has worse weapons, and usually they're expected to lose, so you're already playing at a disadvantage. But here, those expectations didn't hold. There were multiple rounds where the under-equipped team managed to win through smart positioning, coordinated pushes, or just catching the opponent off guard. One of the key dynamics was how both teams adapted mid-game. If one strategy worked, it wouldn't work again the same way. At one point, even firing a bullet had become too predictable. Like you have to do it no matter what. But then how much do you want these guys to keep doing it? Individual players had standout moments. Multi-kills, clutch diffuses, perfectly timed utility. But it never felt like a one-player show. Instead, it felt like two teams constantly trying to outthink each other. By the final rounds, the pressure was visible. Players were cautious, but the fatigue was setting in, and it was only a matter of who would slip up first. The ending didn't come from a single dominant round. It came from a narrow edge maintained just long enough. Loud then forced the entire game into a 1-against-1 confrontation, and picked out Optic just enough to secure the win. OG versus PSG Game 5, the International 2018. The International is known for massive prize pools, so trust me when I tell you. These guys wanted to win, and for an industry that barely sees money, kind of like YouTube, these guys really wanted to win. What made this game especially close was how unpredictable it became, because there was sort of like a feeling which team would have the advantage. PSG were favored heavily, and I am sure some of you bet your accounts on it. Dota isn't always about constant fighting. You don't shoot bullets or throw abilities like a madman and expect more damage to get you the win. You have to farm, position yourself, and think of what the game's end would look like, not just the present. There were moments where one team looked like they had control, only for a single team fight to flip everything. Buybacks played a huge role. Players would die, instantly return, and rejoin fights, creating situations where it was hard to track who actually had the advantage. One of the defining aspects was how both teams committed to fights knowing the risks. There were no safe plays left by the end. Despite me calling it strategic and different from bullet trades, it sort of turned into one. The final moments weren't clean. They were chaotic, fast, and difficult to follow in real time, but that's exactly what made them so intense. In the end, OG would just dare more. They kept applying pressure. Despite the chaos, their fundamentals did not crumble. While PSG did have the longer control throughout the series, OG gambled it all when it mattered the most, and the payoff was a fat check. Dallas Fuel versus San Francisco Grand Finals 2022. 2022 was really one of the best years for esports hype, and even a long-forgotten game like Overwatch got to ride the train. Neither team was really favored much getting into this tie, and we got exactly what we expected. An even fight till the dying moments. In this series, neither team managed to fully dominate for long. Each map had its own story. Some came down to overtime pushes where the payload was just inches away from the checkpoint. Others were decided by last-second defensive holds. What made it especially close was how coordinated both teams were. Contrary to most matches in this list where there have been some moments of individual flash, this one was all about teamwork and coordination, and each team member overwatching the other's movements. There were moments where one team seemed to have the fight won, only for a perfectly timed ultimate ability to turn everything around. When maps got chaotic, Dallas's style worked better because they could initiate fights faster and reset cleaner. They continued to snowball these minor advantages, and it was no shock that Shocks were not able to cope up with the lump of minor battles that Dallas kept winning, which would eventually result in a final victory. The ending felt less like a collapse from one side and more like the other side finally finding a slight opening. Penta versus Evil Geniuses, 6 Invitational 2018. This is like the match that is rooted in comebacks, but what is more interesting is how that comeback came to be. Evil Geniuses started strong, building a lead that looked difficult to overcome. Their coordination, their setups, everything seemed to be working. But Rainbow Six is a game where information and adaptation matter just as much as mechanics. Penta struggled at first, but slowly began adjusting. They changed everything on the spot, from how they attacked to how they gathered information. It seemed as if a different team took their place and the boys aged 40 years in their seats. Round by round, the gap started to close. What made it tense was that you could feel the momentum shifting. There was no definitive point for it, but the adaptation was so crazy that the advantage held no meaning anymore. There were rounds where either team could have secured the win, but small mistakes or unexpected plays changed the outcome. By the time it reached the final map, the pressure had flipped completely. Penta would then reverse sweep Evil Fools and secure a 3-2 victory. The win proved so important that they later changed into G2 Esports. Dignitas versus NRGRLCS Season 5 Game 7. This one is my personal favorite because Rocket League, in my opinion, is the most mechanically challenging game ever made. Dignitas had been the most dominant side in RL for a while, with players like K-Dop and the literal GOAT Turbo towering over everyone. Whereas NRG had the young prodigy Justin, the most consistent player in game's history, Garrett, and Fireburner. It came down to Game 7 after each team secured 3 victories each. Rocket League has this unique feature where, even after the timer has run out, if the ball hasn't touched the ground, the game is on. At the dying moments, Justin would take charge, fly through the air, and bury the greatest goal of all time. I repeated. He scored what is considered the greatest goal of all time, when the timer had already run out. This would turn out to be a monumental moment for the game, shooting it into the mainstream, and even inspired the now famous Quick Chat. This is Rocket League, after a caster screamed the word at the top of his lungs. This miracle would send the game to overtime where, unfortunately, NRG conceded and lost the game. But the effort and the resilience is what makes this match so memorable.